Welcome to the second great lesson, the coming of life. Remember when we talked to you about going far, far back in time? We went back to a time when the whole universe was created with a bang. And then we talked about how the earth was created. And then we talked about the time of volcanoes, and finally about how the rains came and the warm, murky, shallow sea was formed. Now let's go back in that story and see where we can go from there. I remember we told you about the warm, shallow sea that covered most of the surface of the earth, and the water was rich in minerals from the volcanic ash. The sea also had some places where rocks stuck out, making islands from small to very large. There were no plants, no life on earth, and there was no life in the water. There was no soil or dirt on the earth, just rocks, and in that silent sea, in the quiet ocean, nothing lived. Nothing lived on the rocks or stones or in the lakes or in the atmosphere even. There was no movement, there was no sound. The atmosphere was thin so that things from outer space would come in. Dust, rays, meteorites. The waters were warm, rich in minerals, and set just perfectly for life, but there was no life yet. Now, we don't know exactly why this happened, and we don't know exactly how it happened, but inside that warm, nurturing, mineral-rich water, bathed in rays and materials coming in from space, yet contained within the safety of our planet, something happened. Something began to move. I don't know how many times this movement might have happened. Maybe whatever it was that moved had lived for a short time and then died. And maybe 1,000,000 years later that happened again. And maybe it happened many, many times. We just don't know. We do know that eventually something moved and kept moving. That something was life. Life.
People don't actually know how it happened. Some say it just happened. Some say God made it happen. Some say it was destined to happen. Some say that there were waves and materials coming in from outer space, and something in those materials and forces seeded the ocean. We really don't know for sure. But we do know that it did happen. This is what we do know for sure, that somehow, some way, something began to move there in the water. This earliest form of life was only a little tiny cell. So small, you couldn't have even seen it without a microscope. We really don't know what the first living thing was like. Life may have begun at deep underwater hot springs that spewed hydrogen-rich molecules. Another idea is that life started because of comets that brought energy and caused chemical reactions, producing chemical essentials to life. Or maybe life started with small molecules that interacted with each other. These may have been enclosed in simple cases like the outsides of a cell. Still, other people believe that some early life may even have been remotely plant-like, or that there were simply forces that we can't understand at work. Eventually, as life evolved, it began to gain its energy by basking in the light of the sun. The sun shone on it, and it gained energy. There were minerals available, and with the sun's energy, life could form food. At some point, the living thing felt within itself a pull, a pulling apart, a pull that caused it to almost tear in two. In fact, it did split in two, and both of its halves were still alive. And that happened again and again, and that's how it reproduced. And that's how life grew, by splitting in two again and again, and again and again. It was as if life had felt a command to reproduce, divide, make young, and that is exactly what happened.
New living forms continued to come from the first living forms, and over time, life seemed to hear another command that said, "Adapt and change." Some of the forms changed in one way and some changed in another way, so life became different. Even so, all of the living things still lived in the water and gained their energy from the sun. Then some living forms heard commands that said, "Work together, cooperate, collaborate." So some of the cells joined together so they could share their strengths and abilities. One set of cells could do one thing and other cells could do another. In this way, they could become specialists, and they worked together. Then life felt another great command: take for yourself and give back. Life must do this, and so these living things heard this command and took food, nutrition, minerals, and chemicals for themselves. At the same time, they gave back those same things by excretion and by death, because even these living things learned that out of death comes more life. In this way, a circle was created. Now, millions and millions of years later, a time came when some of the living things had a new and different idea. We don't know why, but we do know that they had a different notion. Instead of just lying there in the water, basking in the sun, and letting its rays cover and warm and heat them and give them food, some of the living things had the idea to let others lie there in the sun and gain energy. When the others had done it, these living things would eat them. They would wait until others had gained the energy of the sun, and then they would eat those others. It's a little bit scary, but you do it too. You might lie in the sun yourself, but all that happens is you get a suntan, or maybe a sunburn. You can't gain your food that way, but a plant can. You get the energy of the sun when you eat a plant. Those first living things that did that eat others to get energy instead of just getting it directly from the sun themselves. We call those living things animals. An animal gets its energy by eating something else that gained its energy from the sun.
Another command came to all living things that they had to heed, and that command was love. Create a more efficient love. As they heard this command to create a more efficient love, some of them started to care for their young. We do this to this day because we care for our young in a way that is very different from the first things that lived. At this time, all life lived in the water because life began in the water. Some of them, the animals, thought of not only eating the plant-like things, but also of eating other animals. They thought they might as well eat anything that they could eat, and many of the animals began to do these things to protect themselves as well. Here we see early animals and plants growing in the water. Some have many, many cells and are very big. Some of the animals, like this trilobite, were covered with a hard shell that helped to protect it from others that wanted to eat it. It grew the hard shell so that it could live. It might be able to live without the shell, but not when someone else wanted to eat it. This shell protected it. Some animals that look something like plants are standing here. These are crinoids and sea lilies. Even though they may be called lilies, they are not plants. They are actually animals. They stand hooked to the sea floor with their mouths open and their little fronds on the side forcing food and water toward them. That's their whole life, standing and waving their fronds toward their open mouth. But since they don't move from place to place, but are rooted to one spot, to them it's an interesting life. Others, like this jellyfish, float about, waving fronds underneath in the hopes that they'll bump into something and be able to catch it and eat it. Because eating is one of the first things that all life has to do. A living thing won't live very long unless it can somehow eat.
You'll see that everything is in the water. All life is in the water. Some creatures, like these bivalves, are like mussels or oysters, protecting themselves completely with hard shells. They lie down on the ocean floor where maybe no one will see them, but some other animals became specialists at finding them, like this one, the terror of the sea, the great giant nautiloid. The nautiloid is a huge cephalopod that comes sailing out on the hunt. Look, his tentacles come out from his head. That's why he's called a cephalopod. It means head foot. It's as if his legs sprout from his head. The cephalopod is over 15 feet long, with a great biting beak and arms that catch and grab. You wouldn't want to swim in that ocean. You wouldn't want to be there and have that great cephalopod think, "What a tasty morsel you look like," and grab you and have you for dinner, perhaps. But of course, in this sea at this time, there were no people. These animals and plants that lived at this time lived entirely in the ocean. They started from the single little plant-like thing, and over hundreds of millions of years developed into animals that eventually started to look something like fish. These early fish were a great advance. And I'll tell you a wonderful secret about them. This is a fishy secret, but it's an important one. They have bones. They came up with a great idea, bones. They were the first animals to have a skeleton inside themselves. These other animals have a skeleton on the outside of their bodies. Can you imagine wearing a suit of armor and being glued inside of that suit? You wouldn't have any skeleton inside you, but you'd be glued to the inside of the armor and hang from it. That's the way their life was. Their skeleton, their support, is outside and hard like armor.
Well, the fish came up with a different idea. They didn't want to leave the armor off, so they kept hard, heavy armor on the outside of them as well. These are called armored fish because they go around with big heavy plates of strong material on the outside. They have names like pteraspids and cephalospids. Not only did they have a skeleton on the inside, but they also had a heavy suit of armor on the outside. This heaviness made them slow. It was hard for them to get away. Other animals were able to get them and break through the armor. Before long, some fish began to lose the armor. This made them much faster. Now they were able to get to food more quickly. The armored fish all died out. They didn't succeed very well because, well, they were too slow. It turned out that for fish, it's better to be fast than to be armored. It works so much better. There came a certain time, which we'll talk about a lot more later, when there was a drying up, a great drying up of many centuries. This was a time when there were glaciers, great amounts of frozen water locked up in certain parts of the world. When huge quantities of water were tied up as glaciers, the seas became shallower and shallower. In some places, the glaciers took so much water away from the seas that the ocean began to dry up in many areas. Life was threatened, as living things lived only in the water. Now, some living things needed to find another place to live, another place to go. The first things that did this were probably bacteria and algae. Then came plants that lived very close to the edge of the ocean, where their bottoms could be in the water and their tops could be up in the air. They were very small at first, only a few centimeters high. They had no roots, leaves, or flowers like modern plants. But plant life had arrived on land. We still see plants sometimes like that growing on the shore. Sometimes if it dries out a little bit, they can still live. But other times when it's wet, they can survive in that too. These plants eventually moved a little way out of the water, or possibly the water moved away from them. One way or another, they moved up into the cracks and holes of the land.
One of the first pioneers that lived completely out of the water, on stones or sand, was a kind of plant-like organism called lichens. Lichens are actually a cooperative life form, usually made up of fungus and algae. These lichens lived on rock or stone, and they break it down. They actually eat the mineral in the stone and break the stone down. Eventually, the lichens die, and their bodies, including the minerals that they've broken up, decay. and become soil. Lichens have no roots, but once the lichens die, plants with roots can begin to grow in the same area, and over time, organic matter builds up. This allows other plants to begin to move up onto the ground, and before long, animals that eat plants will appear. Probably the first animals that wanted to eat parts of the new land plants were called arthropods, like mites and some primitive insects that came up onto the land. Then, of course, when the insects arrived, other insects wanted to come eat them. Like the giant dragonfly, can you imagine its wingspread was more than 30 inches? That would be a huge insect to see buzzing around. Its wings were like this. Bzzz. Can you imagine seeing a dragonfly moving with its wings that big? It must have had to eat many other insects, but dragonflies do eat other insects, so that's what they did. Fish like to eat insects too. In fact, fish eat many insects, but once many of the insects were on land, the fish couldn't get to them up there. This, plus the fact that some of the water was drying up, caused some of the fish to begin to move to try to get out of the water some of the time. Many scientists think there was a kind of fish called a lungfish that could come out of the water for short periods of time. Then it could go back into the water and out again and back. Who knows how many fish died trying to climb onto the land? Who knows how many of them didn't make it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows how many fish tried and tried, how many flopped onto the land, ate an insect but couldn't get back to the water. Did that happen 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times? Who knows? Probably many times anyway. But eventually, there were fish that managed to stay out of the water for longer and longer periods, and they had some kind of lung as well as gills. This was the first lung in the whole animal kingdom. When we see salamanders today, they are very much like that. Some of the simplest ones have gills we can see, as well as lungs inside their bodies. They can swim in the water and breathe with their gills, or they can come out of the water and breathe with their lungs. They have two lives, a wet one and a dry one. That's what amphibian means, and that's what these fish became. They evolved into some kind of amphibian, an animal with two lives, a wet life and a dry life, water and land. And amphibians love to eat insects. They were drawn to the land by the insects because they had to have food, and, of course, the animals could not live on the land if there was no food. Once the first animals came onto the land, other animals came forth to eat them. This is always what happens. Before long, there were animals that ate amphibians, as well as eating other living things.
As the drying continued, some new animals appeared. Reptiles. Reptiles are animals that don't need to live by the water. In fact, they can live far from it. Reptiles have a dry and scaly skin, but amphibians are moist. Reptiles lay their eggs out in other places, but amphibians have to be close to water. These first reptiles could go all over the world, and they did. They took over. The dinosaurs are reptile relatives. On our timeline, we can see huge animals thundering across the earth. Dinosaurs, big, strong, dangerous, frightening. You might think you would want to be there, but this would be very frightening. Dinosaurs were the most important animals of the time. They were the predominant animals that covered all sorts of areas. We don't know for sure what happened to the dinosaurs, but I'll tell you 3 ideas that people have. One idea is that something very small, very small, had come into existence. It probably was no bigger than a few inches, and it was furry. How could this threaten a big dinosaur? This tiny animal was probably beneath its notice. A huge dinosaur might not even be able to see it from its height. Because it was so insignificant, it could sneak around without being spotted, and for safety, it could scamper up a tree. These little creatures could go to the Tyrannosaurus or the Apatosaurus, or whichever dinosaur lived nearby, and invade its nests and eat its eggs. These little furry things are called mammals. These tiny animals were among the very first of their kind, and they preyed on the young and the eggs of dinosaurs, among other things. They ate these young and they ate the eggs, but they were so small they weren't worth paying too much attention to. Another thing that probably happened, and most scientists think happened, is that maybe some great object from outer space smashed into the earth and threw up a great cloud of dust that blocked the sun for many years and changed the climate so that dinosaurs couldn't live. That's an idea that is shown by the meteor coming from outer space. That's suggesting that something crashed and caused a great explosion, filling the air with dust. This event is called the KT extinction, and it harmed many plants and animals, as well as the dinosaurs.
What a terrible thing it was for the dinosaurs, because they were so adapted to their place and their time, they couldn't change rapidly to live there. But mammals were able to adapt. We know that there was an object from outer space that did hit the Earth. We don't know for sure if that was the only thing that caused the dinosaurs to die out, but it was certainly a problem. Then there's a third possibility. Here it is, right here. They evolved into birds. Maybe the dinosaurs are still around us, except they have feathers and they chirp. Birds began to appear, and we know that birds are descendants of reptiles. Birds are, in fact, reptiles that have changed in one way. Mainly, their scales have become feathers, although they may still have scales on their legs and feet. Probably all three of these things happened. Probably mammals began to rise and threaten dinosaurs. Probably an asteroid from outer space struck the Earth, and the dinosaurs that had characteristics that are more bird-like survived better. So the next time you see a bird outside, you can think, I just saw a dinosaur flying around my front yard. Maybe instead of a bird feeder this winter, you might set out a dinosaur feeder and feed the flying dinosaur. Beware, a small mammal may come to that same feeder just as they did way back then. Mammals are still stealing food from the dinosaurs. Oh, and then came the time with the great mammals. With the great dinosaurs out of the way, the mammals got bigger and bigger. They thundered across the earth as well. A mighty rhinoceros was over 12 feet tall. A great wolf, the dire wolf, was over 6 feet at the shoulder. The mammoth and the mastodon, elephant-like beings with great coats of fur, trampled across northern climates. The giant beaver grew to over 8 feet long. Most people call these giants megafauna. The giant mammals did not last as long as the dinosaurs because of dangers that they faced. The climate was changing, and competition was increasing.
They also had to cope with a new challenge, a new predator that they had to deal with. This was a small animal, probably not very attractive, that appeared first in Africa. Eventually, some of these started to stand up just on 2 legs. They were very good at hunting mammals. They even became very good at hunting the large mammals. They may have been part of the reason the large mammals became extinct. Of course, there are still millions of mammals today, but the megafauna disappeared. These new creatures, we know, liked to chatter a lot among one another, somewhat like monkeys in trees. They liked to prattle with each other, and perhaps they communicated in different ways. We know that these creatures are still around, or at least their descendants are, because these were our first ancestors, early people. Early people were great hunters, and they were also great scavengers. Even when they found dead animals that some other animal had killed, they would eat whatever scraps or remains they could get. Eventually, as the giant mammals disappeared, our story turns to a new story. Our story now turns to a tale all about one thing. It is the story of people. What happened to people? How did they get to be the way they are? How did they turn from small, chattering animals that raced around, not too attractive, and looking something like apes? How did they change from that into what we are now? Well, that's another story. So we have to wait for yet another time to hear the answers to those questions. For now, you can think about the story of life. Think about where you are in this great story. Think about where the story is in you. There will be more of this story to come, and you are in it.